Okay, so we're going to talk now about two Academy Award-winning screenplays. Annie Hall won Best Original Screenplay as well as Best Picture and Best Director to the famous and fantastical Woody Allen. So this piece of work, Annie Hall, is a really famous movie, and it's very interesting. I think it's a really exemplary example of how much like literature a screenplay can be. It has so much stuff going on, so many sort of great lines. It's very clever, it's very innovative in the way it's set up. It jumps around a lot. A lot of times people, when they first encounter Annie Hall, they don't really even know what to do with this screenplay because it moves around so much and it goes from scene to scene to scene, and it can be a little unsettling to somebody who's not familiar with the screenplay form. But, you know, if you think about it, when you watch movies, a lot of times you'll be in 1996 in a car 1 second, and then you're in, like, 1987 in an office building 5 seconds later, and then you'll be back in the other place, right after that. And you move around, and the camera's going from place to place to place, scene to scene to scene, character to character to character. And we've gotten very used to this when we're watching it on a screen. We're not, on the other hand, very used to it at all when we're just watching it or when we're reading it in a screenplay. So it's something that takes a little bit of getting used to. This thing, I think, is fascinating because it does in many ways mirror so much of what we find delightful in film, but also difficult and complicated when reading. There are a couple scenes that I really want to draw attention to in this piece. The first one is the excellent schoolroom scene in which he's in the classroom, with all these children. One thing that's very complicated, perhaps when you're reading this for the first time, is to actually note that Alvy Singer, the main character, played by Woody Allen, is both a child and an adult in the same scene at the same time. It does become a little bit difficult when the child turns back to Alvy and says, you should. The teacher says you should be ashamed of yourself, and then the students all turn around and they see Alvy as an adult sitting there. So it is kind of weird, and then he goes into the sequence where he's talking about, wondering what all of those kids from his youth ended up turning into. Now, of course, we have Facebook that makes it much easier to keep in contact with people, for better or for worse. But back then, we didn't have this fortune. So one thing I think is interesting is to consider how you would set this scene up, where you have the first boy saying, "I'm president of the Pincus Plumbing Company," second boy saying, "I sell taluses," which means that he's a Orthodox Jew. Third boy, "I used to be a heroin addict, now I'm a methadone addict," and second girl, "I'm into leather." This is sort of a really classic scene, and the way that you show it on camera is something that, again, brings up issues of casting, of camera placement. Who are you going to cast to play these roles? Adults saying these lines, or adults saying these lines with kid voices, or just show the kids themselves? Of course, Woody Allen made the decision to just show children saying these lines, which is pretty hilarious to watch. Another thing to consider is a famous scene in this where it's Alvy and his friend Rob walking down the street talking. One thing that was interesting about this scene is that oftentimes in films when two people are talking and walking, the camera is following along with them. This scene, though, is different because it actually shows the whole length of the street, and Alvy and his friend are all the way at the end of the shot. You can hardly even see them at the beginning of the scene. You can hear their voices clearly, but then slowly but surely, over the course of the conversation, they get closer and closer to the camera. That was kind of a curious and strange decision for Woody Allen to make, but it's one that gives this film a lot of credibility for just its innovation, its refusal to just fall prone to the sort of easy decision-making of just, obviously, we're just going to show these people up close while they're having this conversation. It demonstrates a lot more sort of flexibility and sort of strange, crazy decision-making. Another thing I do want you to consider with this is just how things do move quickly from scene to scene to scene. In the beginning, we just get an abrupt medium close-up of Alvy Singer doing a comedy monologue. Then all of a sudden we're in a doctor's office. Then we're in a house. And then it shows a food stand concession. Then it shows the bumper cars. Then it shows the schoolroom. We go from place to place to place. And one thing I do want you to try getting used to is being comfortable with things moving from scene to scene. And really, when you're reading the screenplay, to try to envision this on your own without the movie in mind. Of course, I totally recommend going and trying to watch the film so that you can do a comparison of the screenplay versus how it is depicted on film. That's totally worthwhile, and I highly, highly recommend it. But I think it is important to take on a directorial role yourself and to really sort of sit there and read the screenplay and try to imagine what would it be like if this screenplay just came across your desk. You're the producer of a production company, and you're the one who has to decide, am I going to turn this screenplay into a movie and start to actually try to envision it? What would this actually look like? Okay? And that brings us to our last screenplay, and perhaps the most complex and daunting one of the ones that we're reading. The King's Speech, screenplay by David Seidler. This movie in 2001 won tons of awards. It won Best Picture Academy Award, Best Director, Best Actor, and, of course, Best Original Screenplay. This screenplay brings something different to the table than the other ones we've looked at. This one pays a lot of attention to the layout of the scene, what the camera is going to be looking at. Whereas the other ones gave a lot of sort of directorial liberty to lay things out however you like. This one, it buttons things down a lot more closely. It's much, much, much more descriptive. It's a lot more sort of complicated to think your way through. And that's one of the things that makes it beautiful, is that it's very literary. It's much more sort of in that Tennessee Williams vein of playwriting and drama, where things are really being described closely and in a lot of detail. You're really being shown the scene as the scene is happening, such as when it begins. We get to see this example of this microphone from multiple different angles. It's very, very sort of descriptive. Whereas the other screenplays we've looked at have been very dialogue-centric, where we just sort of we grasp onto the dialogue, we pay a lot of attention to that, we see what people are saying, and that's the primary driving force. In this one, the dialogue kind of takes a back seat to everything else. Some stuff is that this intense, attention to detail, I think, is played out in a couple spots. For example, on page 4 of the screenplay, it says, "See you," huge metal speaker. "See you," soldiers at rigid attention. "See you," wood, he shuts his eyes. "See you," of course, stands for close-up. So we're being able to just see all this stuff. So shot, 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 shot. We're just seeing all of these things in close-up, one right after another. Another thing is that this screenplay does not pull punches on vocabulary, such as later on that same page when it says, "Close on Sir Blandine Bentham, an elderly, unctuous, studiedly distinguished physician who simultaneously manages to combine pontificating and obsequiousness." Okay? This is usually not the type of terminology that might jump to our mind when we think of filmmaking. But here, Seidler does not slow down. Okay, he wants to try to describe things in the exact perfect literary fashion. He doesn't want to dumb it down just because we're dealing with film, which oftentimes seems and gets sort of pigeonholed as a dumbed down art. So unctuous, for example, means smug piety. Okay, it means that this guy's it's the type of person who's maybe considers himself very religious, but the fact that he considers himself religious makes him kind of a jerk about it. And simultaneously obsequiousness, which means that he's kind of servile. He's kind of, bending and, prostrating himself at the feet of somebody else. And it's kind of a grotesque thing, especially when combined with pontificating. So then that brings up that whole issue of casting. When the director gets the screenplay, he has a lot to go on when it comes to casting this particular character. So when you're reading this, I really want you to think long and hard. How is this particular scene going to be played out? So I encourage you to go find a copy of The King's Speech and watch it and look closely at this screenplay, because a lot of stuff does get rearranged and changed in the screenplay versus the way it's actually done on screen, but you can see the attention to detail that is in the screenplay also goes into that same attention to detail that plays itself out on the screen during the film. One last little piece of intrigue I want to share with you guys about this particular screenplay is that David Seidler, its author, he had wanted to write about this true story of King George, the Duke of York, who suffered from a speech impediment. He'd wanted to write about this project since the 80s, and he actually was requested, in particular, by the Queen Mother to abandon the project until after she died, because, after all, that's her father that this film is about. So Seidler, of course, being a British citizen, he respected her wishes and abandoned the project. And it wasn't until years after the Queen Mother's death in 2002 that he re-picked it up and wanted to, put the piece into work. Another interesting thing about this is that Seidler's wife actually encouraged him to write this screenplay not for the film or for the screen, but to write it in particular as a stage play, because she wanted it to have that sort of stage play aspect to it, where it's not special effects, it's not camera placement, it's none of those things that really is most important. It's the development of the characters. And by focusing on the characters, their particular challenges, the challenges of King George, the challenges of his wife, the challenges of Lionel Logue, the speech therapist, who is also a real historical character, whose journals were actually taken into account when they were making this film, is that as a stage play, all of those characters really come to life. So Seidler wanted to take that into account when writing this screenplay, and ultimately afterwards fused all of the filmmaking elements into it and ended up turning it into a fantastic and artful piece of work.